The slap echoed louder than the $50,000 orchestra. One moment, I was a waitress balancing vintage crystal. The next, my world was spinning, and the metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. Mrs. Choi stood over me, her diamonds mocking my uniform, calling me filth in front of Seoul's elite. She thought she was crushing a nobody. She didn't realize she'd just declared war on the only woman the most dangerous man in Korea actually loves. But before we dive into how a ghost became a queen, I need to tell you something from my heart. My incredible husband made me a promise. If we can build this channel to 1,000 subscribers, he's taking me on a dream vacation I've been talking about for months. But honestly, this is about more than a trip. It's about building a family of people who believe that the overlooked matter, that love can transform darkness, and that every invisible person deserves to be seen. If that resonates with your soul, if you believe in stories that make you feel something real, hit that subscribe button right now. Be part of something beautiful with me. Now, let me take you back to where this impossible love story began. Seoul never sleeps, but I was learning it had no mercy for those who couldn't keep up. My alarm didn't ring at 4 a.m. anymore. I just woke up. My body trained like a dog to rise in the dark, my bones aching before my feet even touched the cold floor. 18-hour shifts had carved out the softness inside me and replaced it with something harder, something that knew how to smile through exhaustion and hunger and the particular loneliness of being surrounded by millions of people who looked right through you. My hands told the story my mouth couldn't. Calluses from scrubbing, burns from industrial steam, nails clipped short because anything else was a luxury I couldn't afford. They smelled permanently of bleach and cheap detergent, no matter how many times I scrubbed them raw under water that never quite got hot enough in my tiny rented room. The other cleaners at the office building called me lucky. Lucky to have 3 jobs when most could barely keep one. Lucky the landlord only raised my rent twice this year instead of 3 times. Lucky to be invisible enough that immigration officers' eyes slid past me in the subway like I was part of the walls. But luck felt like wearing shoes 2 sizes too small and smiling through the blisters because complaining meant losing everything. I'd left Nairobi with my mother's Bible tucked under my arm and a nursing certificate the Korean hospitals laughed at. "Your credentials don't translate," they'd said, their voices polite but final, as if compassion needed a specific language and mine wasn't acceptable. So I became what this city needed me to be. A ghost who scrubbed their toilets, pressed their designer suits, and served their champagne with a smile that never reached my eyes. I learned to be grateful for the work that broke my back. I learned to say thank you when they didn't tip. I learned to disappear. The VIP parking garage was always my last stop. 43 floors down into the earth where Seoul's elite kept their toys. Cars that cost more than my entire village back home would see in a generation. I'd move through those concrete levels like a shadow, emptying trash bins nobody thought about, wiping down elevator buttons that rich fingers had touched without thinking. That's when I heard it, a groan, wet and desperate, echoing from the darkness near the executive parking spaces. The sound a body makes when it's losing the fight to stay alive. Every instinct I'd developed over 2 years in Seoul screamed at me to run, to put my head down, finish my shift, go home to my room the size of a closet, and forget what I'd heard. In this city's underbelly, curiosity was a luxury immigrants couldn't afford. We survived by being deaf, blind, and mute to anything that wasn't our direct business. I'd seen girls disappear for asking the wrong questions, for being in the wrong place when powerful men needed discretion, for having eyes that saw too much and mouths that might tell. But my mother's voice cut through my fear, as clear as if she were standing beside me instead of buried in red Kenyan soil 6 months ago. "Amara," she'd said, teaching me to tie tourniquets when our village clinic ran out of supplies. "Your hands were made to heal, not to hide. Don't ever forget what you are, no matter where you go." I should have walked away. My visa, my safety, my entire existence in this country depended on staying invisible. But I didn't. I pulled out my phone, the screen cracked from a drop I couldn't afford to fix, and turned on the flashlight. My hand shook as I stepped into the darkness between a Bentley and a Rolls-Royce, each car worth more than I'd make in 10 lifetimes. And there he was, a man in a suit so perfectly tailored it probably had his name sewn inside. bleeding out on imported marble that cost more per square foot than my monthly rent. His white shirt was soaked black with blood, his breathing shallow and desperate, and his eyes, when they found mine in the flashlight's beam, held something I hadn't seen directed at me in so long I'd almost forgotten what it looked like. Recognition. Not of my face, but of my humanity. He saw me, really saw me, not as furniture or function, but as a person who might choose to help or choose to walk away. And in that moment, everything changed. The blood was everywhere, spreading across the marble like spilled ink, dark and arterial and wrong. I'd seen wounds like this before, back home when the clinic couldn't afford ambulances and we had to make miracles happen with fishing line and prayers and my mother's steady hands guiding mine. But I'd never seen this much money bleeding out. His breathing came in wet gasps, each one a fight his body was losing. The bullet hole in his side pumped blood with every heartbeat, and I knew from the color, from the amount, from the way his lips were turning pale, that he had minutes, not hours. My hands moved before my brain caught up, muscle memory from a lifetime ago taking over. I ripped off my cardigan, the cheap polyester from Dongdaemun Market suddenly worth more than gold. Direct pressure. That's what my mother had drilled into me until it became instinct deeper than thought. "Stay with me," I whispered in English, then fumbled for the Korean words. "Nareulboa. Look at me. Don't close your eyes." He did something I didn't expect. He smiled. A real smile. Not the polite masks I'd learned to recognize on the faces of wealthy Koreans. It transformed his face from handsome to something almost boyish, despite the blood and the pain. "You're going to ruin your uniform," he managed, his voice rough and tight with agony. Each word cost him. "They'll make you pay for it." "I have 6 more just like it," I said, pressing harder. He gasped, his back arching, but I didn't let up, couldn't let up. All ugly, all polyester, all the same. I needed something better than my cardigan. The fabric was already soaked through, warm and sticky against my palms. My eyes landed on my scarf, the one piece of home I carried every single day. Bright Kenyan fabric my mother had woven herself. The pattern telling the story of our village, our family, everything I'd left behind. I didn't hesitate. I wrapped it around his torso, tied it tight enough to make him cry out, creating a pressure bandage that turned my mother's final gift crimson with a stranger's blood. His designer shirt was destroyed, probably cost more than I made in a month, but he was breathing more steadily now. The bleeding was slowing. "You need a hospital," I said, pulling out my phone with shaking, blood-slicked fingers. "I'm calling an ambulance. And police. Someone did this to you." His hand shot out, surprisingly strong for someone who'd been dying 30 seconds ago, and caught my wrist. "No hospitals. No police." His eyes were clearer now, dark and infinite, and holding something that made my breath catch. "Please, you'll die. I'll die faster in a hospital." He squeezed my wrist, gentle despite the desperation in his voice. "Please, I'm begging you. Just give me a few minutes. Someone's coming." I should have called anyway, should have ignored him and done the responsible thing. But something in his eyes stopped me. Fear, yes, but not fear of death, fear of something worse. "What's your name?" he asked, his thumb absently rubbing small circles on my wrist, probably not even aware he was doing it. "Amara." "Amara," he repeated, testing the weight of it on his tongue, making my name sound like music instead of just syllables. "You're the first person in 10 years who didn't ask how much my life was worth before saving it." The words hit me harder than they should have, because he was right. I hadn't thought about reward or payment or what he might owe me. I'd seen a dying man and thought only about keeping him alive. "I don't want your money," I said quietly. "I know." His smile turned sad. "That's why I'm going to remember this. And you. And I'm going to repay you, Amara. I promise you that." The sound of engines rumbled through the parking garage. Not one car, but several, moving with synchronized precision. 3 black sedans appeared from seemingly nowhere, their headlights blinding after the darkness. Men in dark suits emerged like they'd been waiting, like they'd known exactly where to find him. They moved with military efficiency, lifting him with practiced care. But before they took him, before they could disappear him back into whatever world had spit him out bleeding, he pressed something into my palm. A business card, pristine white with a single name in elegant black script. Kang Min-jun. "Don't lose that," he said as they loaded him into the middle sedan. "When you need me, And you will need me someday. Call that number. I won't need. Everyone needs something eventually, Amara. The difference is, when you call, I'll answer. And then they were gone, leaving me alone in the parking garage, with blood on my hands and my mother's scarf, wondering what I'd just done and whose life I'd just saved. I didn't know then that I'd just saved the King of Seoul's underworld, that my fingerprints on that card had just rewritten every chapter of my future, that the invisible girl who'd learned to disappear had just made herself impossibly, irrevocably visible to the most dangerous man in Korea. I tucked the card into my pocket and finished my shift, scrubbing his blood off the marble until no trace remained. But I kept the card. I kept it, and some part of me already knew I'd use it someday. The black sedan appeared outside my building on a Tuesday, 3 days after the parking garage. In my neighborhood, where rust and poverty painted every surface and laundry hung from windows like surrender flags, the gleaming Mercedes stood out like a diamond dropped in mud. I pretended not to notice. Pretending had become my survival skill. Pretend you don't hear the slurs. Pretend you don't see the disgust. Pretend you don't exist. I walked past with my head down, my grocery bag full of instant noodles and wilted vegetables from the discount bin. "Miss Amara." The voice stopped me, deep, professional, speaking English with a British accent so unexpected in this neighborhood that I turned before I could stop myself. The driver was built like a wall, expensive suits stretched across shoulders made for violence, but his expression was respectful, almost kind. "Mr. Kang requests your presence for dinner." My heart jumped into my throat. "I think you have the wrong person. The woman who saved his life with a Kenyan scarf and refused to ask for anything in return." His smile was slight but genuine. "I assure you, Miss Amara, we have exactly the right person." "I need to work. Your shifts for tonight have been covered. Paid. You're free." The casual display of power should have terrified me. Instead, I felt something else. Curiosity. And maybe, just maybe, a tiny spark of something I'd almost forgotten. Hope. What if I say no? Then I drive away and you never hear from us again. He opened the car door. "But Mr. Kang hopes you'll say yes. He's been waiting 3 days to thank you properly." I should have said no. Should have run back to my tiny room and thrown away that business card and forgotten this ever happened. But my mother's voice whispered again, "Don't hide from kindness, Amara. It's rare enough in this world." I got in the car. The restaurant was in a part of Seoul I'd only ever cleaned, never entered. The driver led me past the main entrance to a private door, up an elevator that opened directly into a dining room I didn't know existed. Crystal chandeliers cast soft light over a single table set for 2, and there he was. Kang Min-jun stood when I entered, actually stood, like I was someone who mattered, and I saw him properly for the first time. Not bleeding out, not desperate, but whole. Devastating. The kind of handsome that seemed deliberately designed to make you forget to breathe. But it was his eyes that caught me, dark and intelligent, and looking at me like I was a puzzle he wanted to spend hours solving. "You came," he said, and I heard genuine relief in his voice. Did I have a choice? Always. He pulled out my chair himself. No servant, no intermediary. His hand brushed my shoulder as I sat, and I felt electricity spike through me. "You could have thrown away my card. You could have told my driver to leave. The fact that you're here, Amara, means you chose this." The food came in courses I couldn't pronounce, each dish a work of art I was almost afraid to disturb. Delicate fish that melted on my tongue, vegetables carved into flowers, soup so perfect it looked like liquid gold. But Minjun barely touched his food. He watched me taste everything with an intensity that should have made me uncomfortable, but somehow didn't. Friends, I need to pause here for just a heartbeat, because something beautiful is happening. You're here with me, living through Amara's story, feeling what she feels. My husband promised me something special if we could reach 1,000 subscribers together. But what I really want is you. I want to build a family of people who believe in impossible love, in second chances, in the power of being seen. If this story is touching your heart, if you feel those goosebumps rising, subscribe now. Let's create something beautiful together. Let's prove that communities built on hope and love can change the world. Now back to the night that changed changed everything. Why am I really here? I finally asked, setting down my chopsticks. Men like you don't have dinner with women like me. Women like you? He leaned forward, his full attention a physical weight. You mean women who risk everything to save a stranger? Women who see a dying man and think of healing instead of opportunity? Women who wear their mother's scarf even though it's the only piece of home they have left? My breath caught. How did you know? I know everything about you, Amara Omondi. 26 years old. Came to Korea 2 years ago with a nursing degree and $300 in your pocket. Work 3 jobs, send money home to your younger sisters every month, even though it means you eat instant noodles for dinner. Live in a room the size of a closet in Garibongdong. No criminal record, no debts, no family here. He paused. And absolutely no reason to help me that night, except that it was the right thing to do. I should have been angry at the invasion of privacy. Instead, I felt seen, truly seen. Maybe for the first time since arriving in this city. You still haven't answered my question, I said softly. Why are you here? He set down his glass, his eyes never leaving mine. Because in my world, Amara, everyone wants something. Money, power, connections, protection. They see me and calculate what I'm worth to them. But you looked at me bleeding on that garage floor, and you saw a man who needed help. Not an opportunity, not a transaction, just a human being. His hand moved across the table, stopping just short of touching mine. So close I could feel the heat of his skin. I want to know you, he said quietly. Not because I owe you, though I do. Not because you're useful to me, though you might be. But because I can't stop thinking about the woman who ruined her only connection to home to save someone she'd never met. I want to know what kind of person does that. I want to know what makes you laugh, what keeps you up at night, what you dream about when you let yourself dream. I'm nobody, I whispered. No, his voice was firm. You're the first person in a decade who made me feel like I might still be worth saving. And that, Amara, makes you the most important person in Seoul. That was the first night, but it wasn't the last. He courted me like I was precious, like I was rare. A private tour of the National Museum after midnight, where he explained the history of each piece with passion that made centuries come alive. He knew the stories behind the pottery, the meaning in the brushstrokes, the politics that shaped dynasties. How do you know all this? I asked, standing in front of a 1,000-year-old crown. When you live in the dark long enough, you learn to appreciate beauty wherever you find it, he said quietly. These things survived wars, invasions, revolutions. They endured, like you. A helicopter ride over Seoul's glittering skyline at dawn, the city that had made me invisible looking almost beautiful from above. He stood behind me, not touching, just close enough that I could feel him there, solid and real. From up here, I whispered, it almost looks like it could love me back. It will, he promised. I'll make sure of it. Walks through night markets where his guards kept their distance and we could almost pretend we were normal. He bought me street food from vendors who had no idea they were serving the King of Seoul's underworld. We ate tteokbokki with our fingers, laughing when I got sauce on my nose, and he wiped it away with his thumb. The touch lingering just a second too long. He never touched me without asking first, never assumed, never pushed. Can I hold your hand? He asked one night, standing outside my building. Why are you asking permission? I said, even as my heart raced. Because you've had enough things taken from you without your consent. I want everything between us to be a choice you make freely. I gave him my hand, and he held it like it was made of spun glass, his thumb tracing patterns on my palm that made me shiver. Slowly, carefully, I began to see past the rumors, past the whispers of what Kang Min-jun really was. I saw a man who remembered every story I told him about Kenya, who asked about my mother's weaving techniques and actually listened to the answers, who looked at me like I was the most fascinating thing in his carefully controlled world. But fairy tales don't exist in Seoul's underbelly, and falling in love with a king meant eventually facing his kingdom, his enemies, and the brutal truth of what he'd done to build his empire. I just didn't know the price would be paid in blood and champagne on a ballroom floor. The helipad was private, perched on top of a building that didn't exist on any map. Seoul sprawled beneath us like a living creature made of light and shadow, and Minjun stood at the edge like he owned every single glowing piece of it. Maybe he did. 3 months had passed since our first dinner. 3 months of stolen moments and secret smiles, of learning what it felt like to be cherished instead of used. But tonight felt different. The air hummed with something unspoken, and Minjun's shoulders carried a tension I'd never seen before. "I need to tell you the truth," he said, his back still to me, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "About who I am, what I really do." "I know what you do." My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I'm not stupid, Minjun. People don't have the kind of power you have from selling real estate." He turned, and the look on his face nearly broke me. Fear. Raw, genuine fear. Not of enemies or bullets, but of me. Of my judgment. "I've killed people, Amara." The confession came out flat, emotionless, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized for this moment. "Not in war, not in self-defense. I've killed people because they were in my way, because they threatened what's mine. Because sometimes in my world, violence is the only language people understand." He took a step toward me, and I saw his hands shake. This powerful, dangerous man was trembling. "I've destroyed families, ruined lives, done things that would make you run screaming if I told you the details. I'm not a good man pretending to be bad. I'm a monster who's been wearing an expensive suit for so long, people forget what I really am." "Why are you telling me this?" My throat felt tight. "Because I'm in love with you." The words cracked on the way out, raw and honest and desperate. "I'm in love with you, and you deserve to know what you're getting into before I ask you to stay. You deserve the truth, even if it means you walk away." He pulled out a box, small and black velvet, and my heart stopped. "I can't give you normal," he continued, opening the box to reveal a platinum ring with a single diamond that caught the city lights like a trapped star. "I can't promise you safety or peace or Sunday dinners with your family. I can't even promise you I'll survive the next year because men like me don't get happy endings." Tears spilled down his cheeks, and I'd never seen him cry before, never imagined this untouchable man could break like this. "But I can promise you that you'll never be invisible again, that you'll never have to bow your head to anyone, that the city that tried to erase you will learn to speak your name with respect, even if they whisper it in fear. I can promise you that every breath I take will be spent making sure you know you're loved, you're valued, you're seen. Minjun. And I can promise you that the world that hurt you will answer to me, that anyone who treats you as less than you are will learn what it means to displease the King of Seoul's underworld." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Is that enough? Can that be enough?" I walked to him, closing the distance between us, and took his face in my hands. His tears wet my palms. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" I said softly. "Not a monster. I see a man who quotes poetry when he thinks I'm not listening, who donates anonymously to immigrant workers' funds, who learns Swahili phrases to make me smile, who holds my hand like it's precious. That doesn't erase what I've done. No, but it means you're not just what you've done. You're also what you're trying to become." I pressed my forehead to his. "I'm not naive, Minjun. I know loving you means accepting the blood on your hands, but you've never pretended to be something you're not, and you've never asked me to be anyone but myself. I don't deserve you. Maybe not, but I'm choosing you anyway, not because I'm blind to what you are, but because I see all of you, the king, the killer, the man who remembers how I take my tea, and I love all of it." "Is that a yes?" His voice broke on the question. "Yes, it's a yes." He slipped the ring from the box, but instead of putting it on my finger, he pulled out a platinum chain. "Wear it like this. Hide it if you need to. The world isn't ready to know you're mine, and I need to keep you safe until I can guarantee no one would dare touch you." He fastened the chain around my neck, the ring resting against my heart, hidden beneath my shirt. "It's a shield," he whispered against my hair. "Even if you can't use it yet, know that it's there. Know that you're protected." We stood there on top of Seoul, Two broken people who'd found something whole in each other, and kissed like we could seal our promises with breath and touch. But across the city, in the shadows, even Minjun's power couldn't quite reach. Someone was watching. A rival who'd seen us together, who'd recognized the impossible. The King of Seoul's underworld had found a weakness, and in this world, weaknesses were meant to be exploited. The countdown to that ballroom, to that slap, to the night everything exploded into violence and revelation, had already begun. We just didn't know it yet. The invitation arrived on cardstock so thick it felt like armor, cream-colored and gold-embossed, announcing the annual Seoul Elite Charity Gala. My name, Amada Omondi, was printed there in elegant script, like I belonged among the names of CEOs and old money families and people whose wealth had generational roots. I stared at it like it might bite. "You don't have to go," Minjun said, watching me from across his penthouse living room. We'd been engaged for 2 weeks, the ring still hidden against my heart, our secret slowly becoming a ticking time bomb. "I can make an excuse. Say you're ill." "No." I forced my spine straight, even as fear churned in my stomach. "If I'm going to be part of your world, I need to face it eventually. I can't hide forever." What I didn't say was that I was terrified, not of the gala itself, but of being exposed as the imposter I was, of having every wealthy woman in Seoul see straight through my expensive dress to the girl who still hoarded expired instant noodles, who woke at 4 a.m. out of habit, even though I didn't need to anymore, who couldn't shake the feeling that this was all temporary. That eventually, someone would realize I didn't belong and send me back to the shadows where I came from. The dress Minjun sent was midnight blue silk that moved like water. Simple enough not to draw attention, but expensive enough that I checked the price tag 3 times before I believed it. The designer was someone I'd only ever heard of while cleaning their boutiques. The stylist who came to my apartment, our apartment now, though I still couldn't quite believe it, looked at my calloused hands and uneven nails with poorly disguised distaste. But she was professional, transforming them with gel and polish until they looked like they'd never scrubbed a toilet or wrung out a mop. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked like she belonged in that ballroom. But mirrors lie, and I knew the truth. Underneath the silk and the styled hair and the perfect makeup, I was still just Amara from Nairobi, pretending she deserved to be here. "You're beautiful," Minjun said, appearing behind me in the mirror. His tuxedo was midnight black, tailored to perfection, making him look like a prince from a dark fairy tale. "I'm scared," I admitted. "I know." He rested his hands on my shoulders, careful not to muss the stylist's work. "But you're also brave. Braver than anyone in that room will ever be. They were born into their world. You built yourself from nothing." "What if they see through me?" "Then they'll see what I see, someone extraordinary." He kissed the top of my head. "I have to arrive separately, politics and appearances. But I'll be watching, and if anyone makes you uncomfortable, if anyone treats you as less than you are, you give me the signal and we leave. Understood?" I nodded, even though we both knew I wouldn't signal. I'd survived 2 years in Seoul's underbelly. I could survive 1 night among its elite. I was wrong. Beautiful souls, we're about to walk into the storm together, and I need you to brace yourself because what happens next breaks my heart every single time I tell it. But before we go there, let me say this. My husband and I are building something special here. A community that believes in the underdog, in justice, in love that transforms. If you're feeling this story in your bones, if you're getting those goosebumps, that tightness in your chest, subscribe. Join our family. Let's prove that the overlooked and underestimated can rise together. Now, let me take you to the night everything shattered. The ballroom was obscene in its beauty. Crystal chandeliers hung like captured stars, each one worth more than most people made in a lifetime. The floors were polished to mirrors, reflecting the designer gowns and diamond jewelry until the whole room sparkled like the inside of a treasure chest. Champagne flowed like water, vintage bottles I'd only ever handled while wearing gloves to serve them. Women floated past in couture, their laughter the practiced music of people who'd never known hunger, never feared deportation, never wondered if they mattered. They moved through space like they owned it. Because they did. This was their world, and I was just visiting. I wasn't seated with guests. Despite the expensive dress, despite the engagement ring hidden against my heart, I'd been assigned to serve. Not as punishment, nobody knew who I really was, but because old habits and old systems die hard. On paper, I was still just Amara the immigrant worker, so Amara the immigrant worker I would be. The irony would have been funny if it didn't hurt so much. I balanced trays of champagne and crystal flutes, my feet aching in heels I hadn't broken in properly. My smile was painted on, the same smile I'd worn for 2 years while invisible. And every time someone snapped their fingers at me without looking at my face, every time they handed me their empty glass like I was furniture, I felt myself shrinking, disappearing back into the ghost I'd been. The ring against my heart felt like a lie. That's when I saw her, Mrs. Choi. I'd heard about her. Everyone in the service industry had. Old money, older prejudice. The kind of woman who measured her worth by how many people she could look down on. She held court near the center of the room, surrounded by admirers who hung on her every word like she was dispensing wisdom instead of venom. I should have stayed away, should have kept my head down and survived the night. But the universe has a cruel sense of timing. The tray of champagne flutes was heavy, and my arms were shaking from hours of holding crystal and smiling through dismissal. I navigated through the crowd carefully, practiced, until someone stepped backward without looking. My ankle twisted in the stupid heels. The tray tilted. And champagne, vintage, imported, probably worth more than my old monthly salary, splashed across Mrs. Choi's designer gown in a golden arc that seemed to move in slow motion. The room didn't go silent, that's a myth. But the bubble of space around us did, a pocket of held breath and anticipated drama, the way crowds always sense blood in the water. "You clumsy fool!" Mrs. Choi's voice cut through music and conversation like a knife. I looked up from where I'd fallen to one knee, trying to gather scattered crystal, and saw her face twisted in rage. Her hand came up fast. I didn't have time to dodge, didn't have time to protect myself. The slap connected with my cheek with a crack that echoed louder than the orchestra. Pain exploded across my face, white-hot and immediate. My head snapped to the side from the force of it, and I felt my teeth cut the inside of my cheek. The metallic taste of blood flooded my mouth, copper and shame. I stumbled, my hands flying out to catch myself. Crystal shattered on marble as I went down, and I felt something slice my palm. More blood. More proof of how badly I'd failed at being invisible. "Filth!" Mrs. Choi's voice rang through the ballroom, first in Korean and then in English, making absolutely sure I understood my place. "You people come to our country and can't even manage the simplest tasks. Do you have any idea how much this dress costs?" I looked up at her from the floor, tears burning in my eyes from pain and humiliation and rage I couldn't express. Around us, Seoul's elite watched with the detached interest of people observing an uncomfortable documentary. Some looked vaguely sympathetic. Others seemed annoyed that the help was causing a scene. But no one moved to help me. No one defended me. No one told her to stop. Because to them, I was invisible, replaceable, a servant who'd made a mistake and was receiving appropriate correction. The blood on my lip and the tears in my eyes weren't tragedy. They were just an inconvenience, a disruption to their perfect evening. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you!" Mrs. Choi grabbed my hair, yanking my head up, and I saw my reflection in her diamond earrings. Small, worthless, nothing. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words automatic, trained into me by 2 years of survival. "I'm so sorry. I'll pay for the dress. I'll pay for it?" She laughed, cruel and sharp. "With what? The pittance they pay you to clean our toilets? This dress costs more than you'll make in your pathetic life. You African." She raised her hand again, and I finally understood the truth with perfect, crystalline clarity. No matter how well I dressed, no matter whose ring I wore hidden against my heart, to these people, I would always be just the help. Just a body to use and discard. Just another immigrant who should be grateful for the privilege of serving them. The ring against my chest suddenly felt like it was burning. I closed my eyes, bracing for the second slap, and heard something that made my blood freeze. The sound of heavy doors slamming open. The orchestra stopped. Conversations died like someone had flipped a switch, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees all at once. I opened my eyes and saw every head in the ballroom turn toward the entrance, faces draining of color, champagne glasses trembling in suddenly nerveless fingers. Mrs. Choi's hand was still raised above me, but she'd gone statue still. And then I heard footsteps, slow, measured, deliberate, the sound of expensive shoes on marble, each step echoing through the silence like a countdown to judgment. I turned my head, still on my knees on the floor, surrounded by broken crystal and spilled champagne and my own blood, and saw him. Kang Min-jun stood in the doorway, and he looked like death in a tuxedo. His face was perfectly calm, almost serene, but his eyes, God, his eyes were black holes of fury, absorbing all light and giving nothing back. He surveyed the room with the careful attention of a king inspecting his kingdom and finding it wanting. Men in designer tuxedos stepped back without realizing they were moving, creating a path through the crowd like Moses parting the Red Sea. Except this sea was made of fear, pure primal fear, the kind that makes your hindbrain scream at you to run even when your legs won't obey. I'd never seen him like this. Never seen the mask drop completely. Never seen the king without any pretense of civilization. He walked through the ballroom and I watched grown men, powerful men, men who ran corporations and controlled politicians, physically shrink as he passed. Women clutched their partner's arms. Security guards touched their earpieces but didn't dare intervene. Because everyone in this room knew exactly who Kang Min-jun was and what he was capable of. He stopped 3 feet from where I knelt, and finally, he looked at me. His expression softened for just a fraction of a second, and I saw his jaw clench so tight I heard his teeth grind. Amara. My name from his lips was soft, almost tender, completely at odds with the violence thrumming beneath his controlled exterior. Are you hurt? I touched my bleeding lip, tasted shame and copper. I'm fine. No. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the silent ballroom like a pronouncement. You're not. He did something that made the entire room gasp. He knelt. Kang Min-jun, the King of Seoul's underworld, the man who made criminals and CEOs alike bow and scrape, knelt on the marble floor in his custom tuxedo and pulled a handkerchief from his pocket. Silk, monogrammed, probably worth more than my old weekly salary. He dabbed the blood from my lip with infinite gentleness, his other hand cupping my bruised cheek so carefully it made my chest ache. Did you know, he said conversationally, still focused on my injuries, that this woman you just struck is my fiancé? The gasp that rippled through the ballroom was collective, visceral, a wave of shock that seemed to physically move the air. But he wasn't done. He reached for the chain around my neck, the one I'd kept hidden, and pulled it free. The platinum ring caught light from 1,000 crystal chandeliers, impossible to miss, impossible to deny. And Seoul's elite finally understood what they'd just witnessed. They'd watched the future Queen of Seoul's underworld get beaten on her knees, and they'd done nothing. Min-jun stood, helping me to my feet with a gentleness that somehow made his fury more terrifying, not less. He kept one hand on the small of my back, steadying me, while his eyes never left Mrs. Choi's face. She'd gone from red with anger to white with fear, the transformation happening in the span of a heartbeat. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. I didn't know, she stammered. It was an accident. The champagne was an accident. Min-jun agreed, his voice perfectly pleasant, perfectly polite, and somehow more threatening than if he'd been screaming. Her response to that accident? That was a choice. He took a step toward Mrs. Choi, and I saw her physically recoil. The crowd around us had pressed back, creating a wide circle, everyone desperate to put distance between themselves and whatever was about to happen. Let me tell you about choices, Mrs. Choi. His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the ballroom. You chose to strike someone you perceived as powerless. You chose to humiliate someone you thought had no recourse. You chose to raise your hand a second time because you believed you could. Each word landed like a physical blow. Mrs. Choi was shaking now, her diamonds catching the light as she trembled. Your husband's construction company, Min-jun continued, pulling his phone from his pocket with deliberate slowness, has been skimming from government projects for 7 years. I have the documentation. Bank accounts in the Caymans, offshore companies, bribes paid to inspectors, all of it. Mrs. Choi made a sound like she'd been gut-punched. Your son's gambling debts? He scrolled through his phone, casual as if he was checking the weather. 847 million won to underground casinos across 3 countries. I bought them all out last week. I own his debts now, all of them. Please. Your daughter's scholarship to Oxford? Funded entirely by money her father embezzled from a low-income housing project. 300 families are living in substandard conditions because he stole their construction budget. I wonder what the university's ethics board will think when they receive my report. Tears were streaming down Mrs. Choi's face now, her perfect makeup running in black rivulets. Around us, I could hear people whispering, phones being quickly silenced, the sound of Seoul's elite realizing they might be next. By tomorrow morning, Minjun said, his voice still that terrifying, pleasant whisper, your husband's company will be under investigation. His assets will be frozen. Your son will be blacklisted from every legitimate establishment in Asia. Your daughter will be explaining to Oxford why her funding disappeared. My children didn't do anything. Neither did she. Minjun's hand tightened on my waist, pulling me closer to his side. But you struck her anyway. You humiliated her anyway. You raised your hand to her again because you thought she didn't matter. He leaned in close to Mrs. Choi, and I saw her go rigid with terror. Let me make something very clear. This woman, Amara Omondi, is not your servant. She is not your inferior. She is mine, and I am hers. And anyone who fails to show her the respect she deserves will learn exactly what it costs to displease me. He turned to address the entire ballroom, his arm around my waist, presenting me to Seoul's elite like a queen being crowned. Some of you knew my fiancé worked in your buildings, cleaned your offices, served your drinks. His voice carried to every corner of the frozen ballroom, and you treated her as invisible, as less than human, as someone whose pain didn't matter. The silence was absolute. Even the servers had stopped moving. That ends tonight. Amara is my chosen partner, and she carries my protection. But more than that, his voice softened, and he looked down at me with something that made my breath catch. She is the only person in this entire city who looked at me and saw something worth saving, who helped without asking for payment, who loved without calculation. He raised his voice again, power and command radiating from every word. So when you see her, you will remember that the woman you overlooked is the only one who saw me, and that makes her more valuable than every single person in this room combined. The room erupted, not in applause, but in chaos. People bowing, apologizing, suddenly remembering urgent business elsewhere. Mrs. Choi's husband appeared from nowhere, physically dragging his sobbing wife toward the exit, while she stammered apologies that were 2 years too late. But Minjun wasn't looking at them anymore. He was looking at me, and in his eyes I saw a question that made my heart ache. Was this too much? Did I go too far? Am I the monster you were afraid I was? I should have been horrified, should have recoiled from this display of ruthless power, from watching a family destroyed in real time, from seeing the man I loved weaponize information with surgical precision. But standing there, with blood still on my lip and my dignity finally intact, I felt something else entirely. I felt protected, valued, seen. For 2 years, I'd been invisible. For 2 years, I'd swallowed humiliation and abuse and told myself it was the price of survival. For 2 years, I'd believed that I didn't matter, that my pain was just the cost of being an immigrant in a city that didn't want me. And in 5 minutes, Minjun had taken that lie and burned it to the ground. I reached up and cupped his face, pulling him down until our foreheads touched, oblivious to the crowd still scrambling around us. "Thank you," I whispered. "For what?" "For making them see me, for making them understand that I matter, for loving me enough to show them what happens when they forget." His arms came around me, holding me like I was the only solid thing in a crumbling world. "I would burn this entire city for you," he said against my hair. "I would destroy every person in this room if it meant keeping you safe. Does that scare you?" "Yes," I admitted, "but it also makes me feel like I'm finally worth something." He pulled back enough to look at me, his thumb gently wiping away the tears I didn't realize I was crying. You were always worth something, Amara. They just couldn't see it because they weren't looking. He took my hand, our fingers intertwining, and led me through the parted crowd toward the ballroom doors. Behind us, Seoul's elite would spend the rest of the night recalibrating their entire worldview, understanding that the invisible immigrant was invisible no more. And the King of Seoul's underworld had just declared war on anyone who dared to forget it. As we stepped into the night, I heard the whispers starting. By tomorrow, everyone in Seoul would know who I was. The ghost had become a queen, and the city would never look at me the same way again. But for the first time in 2 years, I wasn't afraid of being seen. I was ready for it. The penthouse was silent except for the city sounds filtering through bulletproof glass 40 stories up. Seoul spread beneath us like a circuit board, all lights and connections, a living system that Minjun controlled from the shadows. He stood by the window, his back to me, still wearing the tuxedo that had become armor tonight. But his shoulders were slumped now, the king's posture crumbling into something more human, more broken. "Say something," he finally whispered. "Tell me I went too far. Tell me you're horrified. Tell me you saw who I really am tonight and you're leaving." I walked to him slowly, my bare feet silent on cold marble. I'd kicked off the heels the moment we'd entered, leaving them by the door like discarded lies. The ballroom felt like a different lifetime ago, even though it had been less than an hour. "Is it true?" I asked softly. "What you said about Mrs. Choi's family?" "Every word. No hesitation, no softening. I've had files on every major family in Seoul for years. Information is the currency that buys power in my world. I knew about her husband's embezzlement, her son's gambling addiction, her daughter's scholarship fraud. I just never cared enough to use it." "And now?" "Now?" He let out a bitter laugh. "Now her husband will lose his company. His projects will be investigated, and he'll be lucky if he only goes bankrupt instead of to prison. Her son will be blacklisted from every casino in Asia, which might actually save his life, but that's not why I did it. Her daughter will have to explain to Oxford why her funding disappeared, and she'll probably lose her spot." He finally turned to face me, and the anguish in his eyes nearly brought me to my knees. "I destroyed an entire family in 5 minutes, Amara. Ruined lives, ended careers, and you know the worst part? I'd do it again. I'd do worse. Because when I saw you on that floor, when I saw the blood on your lip and the tears in your eyes, and that bitch raising her hand to strike you again, something in me just broke." His hands clenched into fists at his sides. I wanted to kill her, right there in front of everyone. I wanted to wrap my hands around her throat and squeeze until she understood what it felt like to be powerless. And the only reason I didn't is because you were watching. "Minjin, I'm a monster, Amara." The confession ripped out of him like he'd been holding it in for years. "I've killed people. Not in war, not in self-defense, but because they were in my way, or they disrespected me, or they threatened something I cared about. I've ruined lives for less than what Mrs. Choi did tonight." He took a shaky breath. "I killed a man once for disrespecting my mother. I was 19. He called her a whore in front of me, said she'd raised a bastard son. I beat him to death with my bare hands in an alley behind a restaurant, and I didn't feel sorry. I still don't." My heart clenched, but I stayed silent, letting him purge the poison he'd been carrying. "My mother died 6 months later. Heart attack, the doctor said. Natural causes. But I know better. The stress of what I'd become, the fear of what I was capable of, the knowledge that her son was a killer, it killed her as surely as if I'd put the gun to her head myself." Tears spilled down his cheeks now, raw and unchecked. She spent her last months terrified of me, terrified of what I'd do, who I'd hurt, how far I'd go. And she was right to be afraid, because I've proven over and over that there's no line I won't cross, no boundary I won't violate, if it means protecting what's mine. He sank onto the couch like his legs couldn't hold him anymore. "You make me want to be better. You make me feel like maybe, just maybe, there's still something human left inside me worth saving. But tonight proved I'm still the same monster I've always been, just a monster in love, which might be even more dangerous." I walked to him, my heart breaking and healing at the same time. I knelt in front of him, taking his face in my hands, forcing him to look at me. "Do you know what I saw tonight?" I said softly. "Not a monster. I saw a man who loves me so much, he made the world bend to protect me, who refused to let anyone hurt me without consequences, who valued me enough to show an entire city that I matter. I ruined lives. You held accountable a woman who physically assaulted someone she saw as beneath her, who thought her money and status gave her the right to hurt people without consequences. I stroked his cheek with my thumb, wiping away his tears. Minjun, I'm not naive. I know what you are. I know the empire you built isn't clean. I know you've done terrible things.
Then how can you look at me like that? Like I'm worth something?
Because you looked at me the same way when I was nobody. My own tears started falling now. When I was just a ghost cleaning your buildings, invisible to everyone, you saw me, really saw me. You treated me like I mattered before you had any reason to think I did. I pressed my forehead to his. You want to know what I think? I think you're a man who was forged in fire, who did what he had to do to survive in a world that tried to break him. Yes, you've done terrible things, but you've also built shelters for homeless families, funded clinics in neighborhoods the government forgot, protected people like me who have no one else.
That doesn't balance the scales.
Maybe not, but it means you're not just a monster. You're a complicated man trying to do right by the people you love in the only way you know how. And you know what? Maybe the world needs monsters who protect the powerless instead of preying on them. He pulled me up onto the couch with him, holding me like I was the only thing keeping him tethered to earth. I don't deserve you, he whispered into my hair. Probably not, I smiled against his chest. But you're stuck with me anyway, because you taught me something important tonight. What? You taught me that I'm worth fighting for. For 2 years, I believed I deserved whatever cruelty this city handed me. That I should be grateful for abuse, because at least it meant I existed to someone, even if only as a target. I pulled back to look him in the eye, but you showed me that's a lie. You showed me that I matter, that my pain matters, that people who hurt me should face consequences. Amara. So yes, you're a monster, but you're my monster. And if being loved by you means accepting that you'll destroy anyone who hurts me, then I accept that. Because for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm worth something. He kissed me then, desperate and tender and tasting of salt from both our tears. What happens now? He whispered against my lips. Now we build something new, I smiled. Now we take all this power you've accumulated and we use it to protect people instead of just controlling them. Now we show Seoul what happens when the underworld falls in love and decides to be better. And Mrs. Choi? Let her serve as an example. I felt no guilt saying it. Let everyone in the city know that the invisible people they've been stepping on have someone who will fight for them now. Let them understand that cruelty has consequences. He searched my face, looking for judgment and finding only acceptance. You're not who I thought you were, he said quietly. Neither are you, and I love you anyway. We sat there in the darkness, two broken people who'd found something whole in each other, and I understood the truth. We weren't perfect. We probably weren't even good, but we were real, and we were ours. And sometimes, that was enough. Tomorrow, Seoul would wake up to a new reality. The ghost had become a queen, and the monster had found something worth being human for. But tonight, we just held each other and pretended the world outside didn't exist. The wedding happened at dawn on a private beach Minjun had bought just for the occasion. No church, no ceremony with hundreds of guests, no elaborate reception. Just us, the rising sun, and 3 witnesses. His most trusted lieutenant, my one friend from the immigrant community center, and a judge who'd learned that saying no to Kang Minjun wasn't an option. I wore white silk that moved like water, simple and perfect. Minjun wore black, because of course he did. We looked like a study in contrasts standing there on the sand. Light and shadow, innocence and experience, hope and history. I promise, he said, holding my hands as the sun broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, to protect you, to honor you, and to make sure this city knows your name and speaks it with respect. I promise, I replied, my voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. To see you, all of you, the light and the dark, and to build something good from the power you've given me. The kiss tasted like salt air and new beginnings and the ocean spray that misted around us. When we pulled apart, I was no longer just Amara. I was the queen of Seoul's underworld, whether the city was ready for me or not. But I was about to make that title mean something different. My beautiful family, we're almost at the end of this journey together, and I need you to stay with me for just a moment more. This isn't just Amara's story. It's the story of everyone who's ever been told they don't matter, that they should stay small, that they should accept cruelty as the price of survival. My husband and I are building a community that believes in transformation, in using power to protect instead of harm, in the radical idea that love can change even the darkest corners of the world. If you believe in that vision, if this story has touched your heart, subscribe now. Join us. Let's build something beautiful together. Now, let me show you what happened when the Queen decided to rewrite the rules. The Amara Center opened 6 months after our wedding in a building that used to belong to Mrs. Choi's husband. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Money that had been embezzled from construction workers now funded a place to protect their rights. 3 floors of legal aid, language classes, job training, and safe housing for immigrant workers trapped in Seoul's underbelly. We hired lawyers who actually cared about justice instead of billable hours. Teachers who understood what it meant to rebuild your life in a language that didn't belong to you. Counselors who'd walked the same terrified path our clients were walking. I ran it myself, much to the horror of Seoul's elite, who thought the king's wife should be hosting charity galas and wearing designer clothes to fundraisers. But Minjun supported every decision, every late night I spent reviewing cases, every time I came home exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. "You're changing the system," he said one night, finding me at our dining table surrounded by case files at 2 a.m., one person at a time. I rubbed my tired eyes. "It's not enough. It'll never be enough. Look at this." He showed me his phone. A news article about how immigrant worker complaints had increased 300% since the center opened. "You're teaching people they have power, that they matter, that someone will fight for them. That's everything, Amara." The center's first major victory came 8 months after we opened. A labor trafficking ring that had been operating with impunity for years, bringing in workers from Southeast Asia and trapping them in debt bondage. The investigation led back to 3 major corporations and a dozen complicit government officials. Minjun's network provided the evidence: documents, recordings, paper trails that disappeared into offshore accounts. His influence ensured the media couldn't bury it, that it stayed in the headlines until people couldn't look away. And my team made sure every single victim had legal representation and a path to freedom. Seoul's elite was forced to notice, not the invisible workers they'd exploited, but the woman who'd been invisible herself and refused to let others suffer the same fate. I saw Mrs. Choi once, about a year after the gala. She was coming out of a coffee shop in Gangnam, but she looked different. Department store clothes instead of designer. Walking quickly, head down, like someone who'd learned what it meant to be anonymous. Our eyes met across the sidewalk, and I watched emotions flicker across her face. Recognition, shame, fear, and something else I didn't expect. Understanding. She'd lost everything: her husband's company, her social standing, her daughter's scholarship. But maybe, just maybe, she'd learned something in the losing. Maybe she finally understood what it felt like to be powerless. She opened her mouth like she might say something, then thought better of it and hurried away. I didn't stop her. Didn't call out, just watched her disappear into the crowd, like she'd made me disappear 100 times before. Revenge, I'd learned, wasn't about destruction. It was about transformation. She'd been transformed by consequence, and I'd been transformed by power. The difference was what we chose to do with those transformations. Today, the Amara Center serves over 2,000 people a year. We've expanded to 5 locations across Korea, with plans for more. Immigrant workers don't whisper my name in fear anymore. They say it with hope. I'm not invisible, but more importantly, I make sure others aren't invisible either. Minjun still runs his empire, still makes the decisions that keep Seoul's underworld in check. But now part of that empire's purpose is protection. The shelters we fund, the clinics we support, the workers we defend, they're all part of a new vision. Power that builds instead of just taking. Power that protects instead of just controlling. We're not perfect. We'll never be perfect. There are still nights when I wake up and wonder if I've become something I don't recognize. Nights when Minjun comes home with blood on his hands. Metaphorical now, usually, but sometimes not. And we have to reconcile what we are with what we're trying to become. But we're trying. Every single day, we're trying to be better than we were. Last week, a young woman came to the center. She was from Nigeria, working illegally in a restaurant where her boss was taking her passport and most of her wages. She was scared, exhausted, trapped. She reminded me of myself 2 years ago. I sat with her in my office, held her hands across my desk, and told her something no one had told me when I was in her position. You matter. Your pain matters. And I will fight for you. She cried. I cried with her. And then we got her a lawyer, got her into safe housing, and started the process of making her boss face consequences for what he'd done. That's the work now, one person at a time, one life changed, one worker protected, one bully held accountable. Some nights, when I'm lying next to my complicated, dangerous, beautiful husband, I think about that moment in the parking garage, the choice I made to help instead of hide, the decision that changed absolutely everything. I think about the slap that echoed through a ballroom and the revolution it started. I think about the invisible girl who became a queen, not through a crown or a title, but through the decision to use power for those who had none. And I smile, because this story, our story, is far from over. Every day, new people walk through the center's doors. Every day, we fight new battles. Every day, Seoul learns a little more that the people it tried to erase are not going away. We're here, we matter, and we have someone who will fight for us now. That someone used to be me, scared and alone in a parking garage, making the choice to see someone's humanity instead of running away. Now that someone is me again, but different, stronger, empowered, using everything I've learned and everything I've been given to make sure no one else has to feel as invisible as I once did. Minjun was right that night on the helipad. I did transform his power. I took the monster's teeth and used them to protect instead of harm. And you know what? The world does need monsters. But it needs monsters who fight for the powerless instead of preying on them. So that's what we are. That's what we're building. An empire of protection. A kingdom where the overlooked become the valued. A revolution that started with a slap and turned into something that might actually change the world. One invisible person at a time. If you've made it this far, you're not just a viewer, you're family. This story, Amara's story, is about transformation. It's about believing that the overlooked can rise, that love can change even the darkest places, and that every single person deserves to be seen. My husband and I are building something special here. A community that believes in justice, in second chances, in the power of being valued. We started this journey together, and now I'm asking you to take one small step with me. Subscribe. Join this family. Be part of a movement that celebrates the underdogs, the invisible ones, the people who were told they don't matter but proved everyone wrong. Drop a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. If you believe power should protect, not destroy. Share this story with someone who needs to remember their worth. This is more than just a channel. It's a promise that the overlooked, the underestimated, and the invisible can rise together and change the world. Let's prove them all wrong.